Welcome to Hurt at Work, a Kentucky workers' comp podcast. Today, Louisville workers' compensation attorney Scott Scheynost is going to provide helpful information, tips, and advice for injured workers and their families. Scott's goal is to help you to maximize the benefits you receive. If working's got you hurting, sit back and listen to Scott address topics that matter to you. Well, friends, welcome back to the podcast episode. Today, we have Scott Scheynost right here in the studio. Scott, welcome back, guy.
Hey, good to see you. It's 74 degrees outside in the middle of February, so you may not have to put up with me very long today, Jim.
Well, I mean, we're really lucky today with this kind of weather. Hey, Scott, I want to jump in on this topic today. How to jumpstart your workers' compensation claim. And unfortunately, this is something that actually happens, so this advice is actually going to be pretty daggone relevant.
Yeah, I think so. This is probably the number one reason people call me. They've had a work-related injury. They're not getting anywhere. They're not getting medical treatment. They're not getting money for being off work. They don't know what to do. They run into a whole lot of problems. It's been going on for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 5 months, depending on who they're working with and who else is involved in it. But if it's the number one reason people call me, I have kind of a process I go through to advise people to do things to try to get it jump-started. And what I tell them is, number one, they have to give notice to their employer.
That's required by the workers' compensation law here in Kentucky.
By law, as soon as practical. If you don't do that, you have a real big problem with everything. So if you get hurt at work, you've got to tell somebody in a supervisory capacity you got hurt. Then after that, hopefully that person will turn it in to somebody, HR, the workers' comp carrier, somebody to get your case going and get you a workers' comp adjuster that will pay you money for being off work, help coordinate your medical treatment, pay for that, and make sure that you get better and can go on to better things in life. But that does not always happen.
And the fact is, if you're injured on the job in Kentucky, ideally, workers' comp ought to just kick right in. I mean, that's why the system was set up. But like you said, sometimes games get played. And that's where the worker, I think, is at such a disadvantage because this might be their first injury. Right. But the company, a lot of times, kind of knows how to play the system. And it sounds like that's kind of what this is.
Right. There are actually laws in the state of Kentucky that require your employer and the workers' compensation insurance carrier to promptly handle your claim. Unfortunately, my experience over the last couple of years is those laws have not been vigorously enforced. And if they are enforced and if the carrier or the employer is fined, it's a minimal fine. It doesn't go to the employee. It goes to the state.
Wow. So
there's not a whole lot of incentives for the company to honor some of these laws, and sometimes they don't. But, people get hurt, and they don't get treated right. If they got treated right, I probably wouldn't have a job, to be honest with you. And they're always just trying to get taken care of. A lot of people are not looking for money. They just want to get better. And even in those situations, they run into a lot of roadblocks. And then the roadblocks come from all over. Roadblocks come from the boss who doesn't report it. He might be getting a bonus for not having injuries. He might be getting a safety bonus. He might be too busy to report it. He might not know how to report it. Same thing with human relations. You run into people that, for whatever reason, just don't push it down the road. Carriers, you have problems with those. They don't get the information. They need more information. Some of the adjusters on around. My experience over the last couple of years is carriers all seem to be hurting for adjusters to handle these cases. It seems like the older adjusters that actually knew what they were doing all retired over the last couple of years, and we're dealing with a lot of people that might be handling claims in the state of Kentucky and also Indiana and Colorado and New Jersey. And
because workers' comp is state specific, I mean, it's easy to get the rules and the processes mixed up.
They're all different. They may be using different forms. There's all kinds of little things that can kind of come in your way in these things.
Well, at the beginning of the episode, you said, when I get that call, there's kind of a process I go through in telling people how to begin to jumpstart that workers' compensation claim.
Right.
So the first step is, hey, you need to report it to your supervisor, your boss, somebody higher up the food chain.
And hopefully that takes care of everything, but a lot of times it doesn't. But, tell your boss or supervisor you got hurt at work, what happened, what part of your body got hurt. You're required to give notice by law. One of the reasons is let the employer investigate it to make sure you actually got hurt at work. And then the burden shifts to the employer. They're supposed to do something about it. They're supposed to turn it into the workers' comp carrier, create a first report of injury form, send that in. They may have to report it to the state of Kentucky, the Department of Workers' Claims. There's all kinds of things that should happen. But once your boss learns about it, once somebody in a supervisory capacity learns about it, it's supposed to be moved down the road to somebody that can take care of it, whether they're in human resources or forwarded on to a workers' compensation insurance carrier. Once you report it, something else is supposed to happen.
So let me ask you this. I'm injured, and I end up going to the hospital or going to the ER or going to even an urgent care or somewhere to get checked out. Obviously, I'm going to get a bill. And if
Right.
if the company hasn't
Right.
done anything, I mean, what happens?
Well, you get billed. The provider is going to expect you to pay for it if they don't have the information about who your workers' compensation insurance carrier is. Most of the time, when you go to the hospital, you go to ER, you go to immediate care center, you fill out a whole lot of forms, and I guarantee you somewhere in that form is a form that says you're going to pay the provider for the treatment that you get if somebody else doesn't pay it. And you're also going to pay their attorney's fees, and you're also going to pay expenses and late fees for it too. So just to get in to see a doctor or any kind of provider, you're committing yourself to take care of this bill. Now, if your employer or workers' compensation carrier doesn't do that, then you got to start doing certain things. You got to make sure they have the bill. You may have to report it to the Department of Workers' Claims. You may have to file a formal claim yourself. But you will get done on that bill. If it's not paid, they will expect you to pay it. Again, it's up to your employer really to get this thing jump started. But a lot of times they don't for a lot of different reasons.
Okay, so you've let your boss or your supervisor know something happened, and it's just not working.
Right.
What's the next step?
Well, again, they're supposed to fill out forms and report it.
Yeah.
Hopefully, they will move it down the chain, and you'll get a workers' compensation adjuster. If your boss or your supervisor doesn't do anything, and this sometimes happens for different reasons, and I always recommend that you talk to your boss or your supervisor first, because you're going to work there or probably continue to work there, and you want to keep a good relationship with them. Most people don't like it when you go over their heads. But sometimes they just don't do it. Sometimes you don't have a choice. Sometimes you're required.
Like you said, there could be hidden motivations
Right.
as to why they're not doing it.
There's all kinds of things and reasons. But if they won't do it, then you've got to go over their head. You've got to go over their head to their boss, probably human resources, the safety director, however your company or your business handles things, and talk to them. And hopefully they will give you some resolution. Now, a lot of times the boss is not a workers' comp expert. They don't know what they're supposed to do. They don't know if they're supposed to fill out forms. But if you're in a bigger company, you should be able to find somebody that does that, that's probably done it before, that knows what to do and how to handle the case, and that should get your case going.
So the HR department is actually a good resource. I mean, when something like this is happening.
And what I'm finding out is some of the HR departments aren't even at the facility anymore. They're
Right.
being run by a person in Wyoming, and they're doing it remotely. So it might be hard to find that person that's doing the HR. But if you can find HR, if you can report it to somebody and try to get them to help you, what they should do is get the first report of injury form going. They should report it to the workers' comp carrier, and then a lot of times it gets turned over to the workers' comp carrier. But even then, sometimes HR sits on it for a whole bunch of reasons. You can't find them. They don't want to do it. They don't think you got hurt at work, whatever the reason is. If that happens, then you've talked to your boss, you've talked to HR. The next step, I think, is to talk to the carrier.
So this is the insurance company the company has hired to represent them or to insure them in the event of workers' compensation injuries.
Every employer with one employee in the state of Kentucky is required to have workers' compensation insurance. Every employer with workers' compensation insurance is required to post somewhere where the employees can see it a notice about who that workers' compensation insurance carrier is.
And that might be the break room, the lunchroom, the cafeteria, someplace like that.
And a lot of times that doesn't happen. So if it doesn't happen,
Right.
How do you find out who the workers' compensation insurance carrier is? Well, you contact the Kentucky Department of Workers' Claims. And there's a 1-800 number to call. I don't have that memorized. I do know that.
I'll actually put that in the show notes for you.
Okay.
I'll list that out.
But I know the regular number, which is 502-564-5550. You can call that number, press 1, speak to a workers' compensation specialist, and they can look on the computer if you've got the correct name of your employer. And if you can't think of who you actually work for, look at your W-2 forms. It'll be on that. But they can sync that with the registry of all the workers' compensation insurance carriers in the state of Kentucky and all the employers. And every time an employer gets workers' compensation insurance care, they're required to have the carrier report that to the Department of Workers' Claims. So they have a database. And if you're working with an employer that does have workers' compensation insurance carrier, the folks in Frankfort at the Kentucky Department of Workers' Claims can go through their computers and figure out who that carrier is. They can figure out who the carrier is. They're supposed to have contact information for the carrier, a number to call, a telephone number to call, and an address. And sometimes you can bypass your boss and human resources and contact the carrier directly. Now, if you do that, if you go to the Kentucky Department of Workers' Claims and you get the carrier's information and you contact the carrier directly, a lot of times the carrier won't do anything till somebody at your company reports the claim.
But still, that does not take you out of that responsibility to let your boss know in the first place. That
Correct.
still
You
is
still
there.
got to give notice.
Yeah.
But assuming you've given notice and you just aren't getting any satisfaction with where this claim's going, you're not getting any medical treatment, you've been off work, you hadn't been paid, this has been going on for 6 weeks, which sometimes happens. Your next step after talking to the boss in HR, I think, is to talk to the carrier. and then contact them directly. Sometimes they'll deal with you. They'll go ahead and start their own forms that need to be reported to the Department of Workers' Claims. They'll give you a claim number. They'll usually assign it to an adjuster. Sometimes it will require somebody at your company to do that. But it's a little bit different when the carrier is contacting HR than you. HR usually knows they've got to do something now, or somebody's going to get mad at HR, or they may even be violating the terms of the policy with the carrier. So it puts a little bit more pressure on the company to get their stuff together, report the claim. And a lot of times that helps to get your case started. Now, you're not going to be making any friends with this, but a lot of times you're not making friends with workers' comp, and you really don't have any choice. You've got to go over people's heads sometimes to get this going. So if you can get that information and contact the carrier directly, sometimes that helps. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the carrier still puts up roadblocks because, like I said before, they expect your company to do certain things, and your company hasn't done that.
Let me ask you this, though. Obviously, you represent injured workers in workers' compensation claims. If you finally get to a hearing with a judge, can you bring this into the hearing, and does it have any effect on how the judge might act or react in this case?
Sometimes. If this gets back to what I was saying earlier before, that there are certain laws that prevent a carrier from just sitting on things. We call that bad faith. If the carrier just ignores it, if your employer just ignores it, they're committing bad faith in the insurance claim. If they deny the claim just because they want to deny it, they can't do that. They have to have an actual reason. If a claims adjuster that's not a medical provider says you can't hurt your knee, bending over to pick up something, well, that's an opinion of somebody that's not a doctor, that it's not work related, and they can't rely upon that. So they've committed bad faith in doing that. They have to have an actual doctor say you can't get hurt that way, or a nurse or physician's assistant. But you have these bad faith laws, and there are methods to enforce those in your case later on down the road. If the judge thinks that the carrier has denied your claim unfairly, you can get some things. You can get your attorney's fees sometimes. It's one of the rare cases where you can get attorney's fees in the state of Kentucky. If the carrier has committed bad faith and you can prove that, and if the judge is willing to do that, you can get your attorney's fees awarded. That's actually pretty rare in the state of Kentucky for a whole bunch of reasons. You may get your costs. Sometimes you have to hire a doctor, for instance, to do this, to relate everything to the injury at work. You might be able to get those costs. The laws allow this to occur, but it's actually a pretty rare occurrence. It's pretty rare for it to happen. But sometimes the threat of this happening gets things moving too. Now, if it's egregious enough, if what the carrier, the company, the supervisor has done, if it's just so flat out obvious that they've committed bad faith, then you've got a good shot at it. But there's always gray areas. The carrier always has an excuse. I've heard we had a tornado come through last week. We've had floods in the office, which turned out to be true a couple times. Things happen. COVID's probably given a lot of these carriers a really big excuse because it slowed things down. People were working remotely. Everything's just moving slower. But if there's any kind of an excuse, legitimate excuse, generally it's going to be hard to get that award for bad faith. But sometimes, things get denied for no reason at all with no excuse. And there is a possibility that you could get some extra benefits in the form of your attorney's fees and expenses and cost out of this. But again, that's very rare.
Yeah, don't count on it, basically.
But again, sometimes the threat of it's better than actually
right.
the opportunity to get it.
Well, and we're really talking about, we're trying to get this process started. So sometimes
we're just
a little extra.
We're just trying to get your benefits right now.
Yeah.
And really what I'm trying to give some people are some hints to get this going without getting an attorney involved in it right now.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about how the attorney can help you in a minute.
Well, there's another scenario that we've previously discussed, and I'll put a link in the show notes to this. There is a possibility, unfortunately, that your employer may have either let the workers' compensation lapse, or maybe they just didn't have it to begin with.
Well,
that still doesn't mean you can't get coverage.
That's actually the fun part, because they're required to have workers' compensation insurance, but sometimes they don't. Like you said, they let it lapse. I've had several people tell me, well, I only had 4 employees, so I didn't have to have workers' comp insurance. I think that's the law in North Carolina. I don't know. I'm not admitted there, but I know it's not the law in Kentucky.
We'll have to check Wikipedia, I guess.
Yeah. But and there's all kinds of excuses for people not having insurance. But it happens a lot. I see a lot with the trades, with especially builders, roofers, painters, stuff like that.
Yeah.
People that just open up their business, haven't gotten it going. Some people don't know that they're supposed to have it because, again, they think that you have to have a certain number of employees. But in Kentucky, you're required to have workers' comp insurance. A lot of times, that's the reason why stuff's not getting paid. They don't have insurance. And like you said, there is a way to get paid your workers' comp benefits even if your employer does not have workers' compensation insurance in Kentucky. And that's a government agency called the Kentucky Uninsured Employers Fund, which basically steps into the shoes of the workers' comp carrier and will pay the injured employee all the benefits they're entitled to receive: medical treatment, lost wages, money for permanent disability. They'll pay all those benefits. The problem is you're generally required to file a formal claim to get the Uninsured Employers Fund involved. They just don't go out there and look for cases that don't have insurance. They wait for an attorney to file documents that bring them in before they do anything. So, and the law actually requires them to have some kind of an award from a judge before they pay anything.
Right.
So they're out there, but you're going to need a lot of technical help to get them involved.
But friends, if you're in that unfortunate situation where you realize your employer either probably doesn't or definitely doesn't have the workers' compensation insurance, I'd encourage you to check out the show notes here. Scott does have a very in-depth episode on that. And I think there's contact information there that we outline the entire process there. So, Scott, you made a hint here that even before that fund can kick in, they have to have a letter from an attorney. And I'm starting to think that this might be the next step in trying to undo this logjam.
Yeah, I think the fund, there's actually a statute that says before they pay anything, they're asking, it has to be an opinion from an administrative law judge that they have to pay anything. So you've got to file a formal claim and go through the process and basically get an award. So it's a great resource if there's no insurance, because eventually you will get your money. The bad part is you're going to have to jump through a whole lot of hoops and over hurdles to get it, but eventually you'll get what you're entitled to receive. But the other thing, too, on top of all the things we've talked about, going to your boss, HR, contacting the carrier, there's another resource that is available, and I advise people to call this a couple times a week, and that's the Kentucky Department of Workers' Claims. And that number I gave you before, 502-564-5550, you can call that number and ask to speak to a workers' comp specialist. And sometimes they'll do all the things I've just mentioned that you ought to do. They'll contact the carrier. Sometimes they'll contact HR. It depends on who you talk to and what's going on with your case as far as the amount of help you're going to get. There are different workers' comp specialists. I really don't know what their criteria is. I've seen them really bend over backwards to help a lot of folks. I've seen some other people that had some things I thought they would help them with real easily that didn't get very far. And I think maybe it's sometimes how people present it to the department. But these are government employees that have been hired to help folks resolve their workers' compensation issues without hiring an attorney. So it doesn't cost anything to call that number. Even if you don't get your claim resolved by calling that number, you haven't spent any money. They can do things quicker than I can, because if you call me up, we generally have to figure out what's going on, get your medical records, send a letter to the carrier that we're representing you. There's just not a snap your fingers way for me to get your case going over the telephone. It takes a while. I can't argue that you're entitled to benefits unless I have medical records saying that you're off work. We have to have a little background too before we can get going on these things. So there's a little bit of lag time between when you call me and when we actually can get going on your case. The Department of Workers' Claims, though, is as easy as call them on the phone right now. You can call them right now, tell them your situation. Hopefully they'll be able to help you. I commonly tell people there's about a 20% chance they'll help, which means there's an 80% chance they won't be able to help you, but it's a free call. And if you're in that 20% chance that they help, then you've gotten a lot farther than you would get without calling them. But again, these are government employees. I think you've got to be able to present your situation to them in a manner where they can understand it and they can feel like they can help you. It helps to have your employer's exact name, the date of your injury. It would be great sometimes to have your medical records show that you were hurt at work. A lot of those can be accessed over the internet now. If you can present all that stuff and do a lot of the work for the folks at the Department of Workers' Claim, you make their job easier, and I think you have a lot better chance of getting your situation resolved.
Well, it's like my mom always said, you get a lot further with sugar than you do with vinegar.
Right,
I mean,
right.
people are people.
Right.
So I know you're probably going to be unbelievably frustrated, probably anxious, maybe even downright angry. But you got to remember, you're asking for help, and there's one way to get it, and there's one way to make it more difficult to get.
That's the quickest, fastest way to get help, is to call that number. Now, I tell folks again, 20% chance they can help you, 80% chance they can't. Well, if you've got a carrier or employer that ignores them like they're ignoring you, you're not going to get anywhere. And that happens. And like I said before, a lot of carriers don't have adjusters like they should. People have retired. Their work is slower. Some of them just don't answer the phone. They're required to, but they don't. But the Department of Workers' Claims can swing that Unfair Claims Settlement Practice Act legislation over their head a little bit more and threaten them with fines and convince them they need to help you and do a couple other things to put a little pressure on them if they want to, that hopefully will get your case going. But again, sometimes the carrier just ignores them. If that's the case, you aren't going to have a choice but to file a formal claim. And that's probably where you need to get an attorney.
Well, and that's what really kind of brings you in with your practice. And yeah, obviously you could go through all these steps and you could really try this and wait and get frustrated, or fairly early on, you could just contact a workers' compensation attorney here in Kentucky.
And I'm happy to talk to you just like I'm talking on this podcast right now. As an attorney, we deal with this all the time. We would have to figure out what's going on and talk to you a little bit to see how we can help you. And again, when we get involved in a case, we generally have to get a little bit more information than just a phone call, some forms you have to fill out, and some medical records regarding your condition. So we would need to get those documents together before we can proceed with your case. But in general, we handle these cases on a contingency fee, so don't charge anything up front for them. Doesn't cost anything to call me, just like it doesn't cost to call the Department of Workers' Claims. It's a free call. I can kind of assess your situation, give you my 2 cents worth about what needs to be done, where it's going. I'm happy to do that. I do that a couple times a day, it seems like. And most of the time we can help folks. The bad part is it just takes a little bit of energy and takes a little bit of work to get going because, like I said, the insurance carrier needs a letter from me that I'm representing them. We've got to figure out who the insurance carrier is, too. We've got to figure out their address, claim numbers, all that kind of stuff. We've got to work through the process, too. And sometimes we go through that process and we found out, just like you said before, there isn't any insurance.
But at least you understand the process. At least you can probably navigate that and communicate that more effectively. And you just understand how to get it done. And that's, I guess dealing with Scott Scheynost, I mean, you've been in this area of law for a long time. And you've seen a lot of things. You've put up with a lot of things. And you've just learned how to get it done.
Well, I said it twice today, and I say it a couple of times every day, it seems like. If the workers' compensation insurance carriers and employers treated people fairly, I wouldn't have a job. And most people, I think, in a workers' compensation injury, especially ones that have a permanent injury, and we haven't even gotten to discussion about benefits from the permanent injury, but if you've got a permanent injury, you just go ahead and call an attorney at the beginning because you're going to need them at the end. You might as well get them going at the very beginning. All the footwork and all the background information that we talked about, we need to get going on your case. We can go ahead and start getting going on that at the very beginning. The more serious the injury, the more your problems are, the more you need an attorney. If you have a minor scratch that's going to get resolved by one trip to the doctor's office, you probably don't need an attorney for that. If you've had an injury that keeps you from working the rest of your life, you need as much help as you can get.
Stakes are pretty high at that point.
Yeah, and everything in between. But in general, if it's a permanent problem, and in Kentucky, the way we do things, permanent problems generally result in an impairment rating, which means you get money after you recover from your injury, whether or not you go back to work at your old job or not. You also get benefits. For instance, you might be able to get lifetime medical care, too.
Well, and that's an important distinction. Just because it's a permanent injury doesn't mean you can't work. It just means, hey, you've got an impairment rating.
Correct.
It doesn't mean you're done. I mean, it's not necessarily career ending.
That permanent,
there's all sorts of levels of these injuries, I would think.
That permanent injury with an impairment rating puts money in your pocket after you reach maximum medical improvement, after you're done with the doctors, essentially.
Right.
And even if you go back to work at your old job, even if you're making as much money as you did before, if you had a permanent injury, that still could put money in your pocket and result in additional medical treatment, too.
Which obviously, based on the extent and the severity of the issue, you may need that ongoing medical treatment. I
agree. And then also, too, is I tell folks, remember, you're swimming in the pool with sharks. The people at the carrier's office or maybe human resources at your employer that do this all the time, this is not generally their first workers' comp insurance claim. They may have 30 of them on their desk right now, just like I do. And they know what's coming up. They know where it's going. They know your injury is going to result in certain things down the road. If you've got a herniated disc in your back, you may end up having a surgery. They've seen it before. And
there's games that can be played. It's like a car wreck. Sometimes they're going to give you a low-ball offer just to try to get it done.
Well, they'll steer you to certain doctors that will help them and low impairment ratings and less treatment, and they'll try to convince you that you don't need things that you do as far as medical treatment, and then they'll also make offers to you that may not be that great. And there's just a lot of different things that come up that they've done before. they take classes on this to make sure they can maximize the recovery for them.
Yeah.
Their job is to help the carrier, not you. And again, like I said before, if people got treated fairly, I wouldn't have a job.
Well, Scott, a while back, you mentioned that you work on a contingency fee basis, and it doesn't cost anything to call you. How do your fees actually work, though, in a compensation case here in Kentucky?
Our fees are governed by a statute that says we can never recover more than 20% of what the injured individual gets, and never more than $18,000. And there's a couple of tiers in there that also involve that, but I'm not going to get into them right now.
Right.
But basically, it's never more than $18,000 and never more than 20%.
Right. If it were a normal injury case, like a car wreck case, in Kentucky, attorneys have to state that case expenses and fees are the responsibility of the client. How does that come into play in a comp claim?
As far as expenses, we have the same obligations too. There are expenses that we will normally incur in a workers' comp claim. These include payment for medical records. In general, we'll have to send you to either get a report from your treating doctor or to an independent medical examination that can cost a couple hundred or even $1,000. So those are expenses that we normally pay up front. And then at the end of your case, we collect those after our fees deducted from the recovery. That's generally how we get paid. And fees typically in a workers' compensation claim are going to run anywhere from $500 to $3,000. And it can be more than that, it can be less than that, depending on what's going on.
But that's ballpark.
That's, general part. They're not usually as much as they are in a regular personal injury case for a bunch of different reasons. But I would anticipate fees of around $2,000 for a fairly significant workers' comp claim at least. And then the more complicated your case is, the more likely it is you're going to incur more fees. But then again, you have a bigger case, and probably it justifies that too.
Well, absolutely. You wouldn't want to run that by yourself, that's for sure. Scott, let me ask you this. If somebody's been listening to this and they want to get in touch with you, your primary office is out off Dixie Highway, and you have another office over in the East End there. But what's the best phone number? What's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
The best way to reach me is through my phone, which is 502-937-5287. 502-937-5287.
And, of course, there are a lot of other things you can do. Scott has a Facebook page that's pretty active, and he's also got a website, ScheynostLaw.com. That's SCHEYNOST law.com, and I'll have a link to that as well in the show notes. But there's a Contact Us form there that you can fill that out really quickly. But it might be just easier just to pick up the phone and give him a call.
Yeah, and thank you for spelling Scheynost. That was probably the hardest thing you've done today. But we have a website. We've got a FAQ section on there that answers a lot of questions that we spent some time developing. I think I've bored you to death probably over a couple of years trying to make that even bigger. But I think that website with that FAQ answers a lot of questions, too. You can do that on your own time, 3 o'clock in the morning. And again, I think that will give you a lot of peace of mind if you look at that. But we're happy to talk. I talk a lot if you can't tell from listening to this podcast. But this is what we do. I look forward to calling you if you have any, or talking with you if you have any questions. And again, it's a free call. There's no obligation. So happy to help.
Outstanding. Scott, I know you're busy, buddy. I really want to thank you for your time. Thanks for the information. And I hope a lot of people don't have to go through this. But when they do, it's good to know you're in the neighborhood and you're willing to take their call and see what you can do to help them.
I hope you don't need me, but we're here to help if you do.
Outstanding. Have a great day, and we'll be back in a few weeks.
Great. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to this episode of Hurt at Work. Scott will be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. For more information, be sure to visit ScheynostLaw.com. That's SCHEYNOST law.com. You can also follow Scott's Workers' Comp office on Facebook. Until next time, be safe and remember, Scott's ready to help, especially when you and your family need it the most.